Lou, thanks for sitting down with us to talk a little bit about the current mood in politics. It's been a historical week, obviously starting on Saturday, and that's where I want to start, as I have with a couple of these conversations this week. I want to address it. The attempted assassination on former President Donald Trump, not something that any American wants to see. Just kind of your reaction when you heard of the news.
Yeah, certainly horrific and horrific development. And I think, I said this on another TV show, and as much as possible, there is no place for political violence in America. None. It just doesn't belong in America. We settle our disputes. We have disagreements. We have debates. But we settle our disputes at the ballot box. And that's the way it should be. And that's the way this country was devised. I thought President Biden was forceful in his condemnation, coming out and trying to unify the country and calling Donald Trump directly, calling the victims, and giving a speech from the Oval Office later, trying to take the temperature down a little bit. And I thought his reaction to that was important. And my hope is, and I was disappointed, frankly, to see people like J.D. Vance, for example, immediately turn to blame the Democrats. It's like, this isn't the time to do that, right? So I think, when you're looking at political violence, it has been something that's been more and more increasingly a huge problem in this country. And it's something that we should never have to resolve our differences that way.
You mentioned President Biden's Oval Office address on Sunday night, just over 24 hours after the incident. And it was a lot of that toning things down, was what we heard him say, the political rhetoric. You do a lot of work in Columbus, which is obviously a big hub for politics here in the Buckeye State. So I'm sure you hear those conversations day in and day out amongst lawmakers. Where does that responsibility lie to maybe scale back some of that talk?
Well, I think you see this happen a lot, with the rhetoric. It gets heated. Obviously, social media, I think, amplifies that. Sometimes the loudest, most divisive voices are often amplified the most. And so I think we probably see this more at the national level than we do at the local and state level. But it's crept into our politics, and the misinformation, the divisiveness, there's just no place for it. And, I've run for office, as you know, on numerous occasions. And quite frankly, I've seen this develop more and more beginning around 2015, 2016. We really saw this start to creep into our mainstream politics where, quite frankly, people were just heated and the rhetoric was amplified. And of course, you get into the heat of a difficult campaign. And, with social media, with a lot of the communication apparatus out there now, a lot of this information floods and it gets people upset and hot and bothered. And so it's incumbent upon leaders, I think, as President Biden, I thought, did, as good as he could, to come out and really just try to say, I want to unify the country. We want to, take the temperatures down, no more finger pointing. Obviously, there's going to be debate. It's a presidential election year, and we're going to fight about taxes and various policies, right?
And that's what that was going to bring up my point. There's a difference, and you might be able to speak to this from the candidate perspective. There's a difference between having that campaign talk and maybe criticizing your opponent for a bill they sponsored or their stance on a particular issue, and then taking it to these violent acts that we've seen. You think back to January 6th and what happened there. You think back to last week and what happened with the president, and there were other attempted assassinations on former presidents in history.
Paul Pelosi was beat over the head, and quite frankly, disappointed to see the former President Trump actually mock that situation. Right? It's like there's times where I'm brought back to the time when John McCain was hosting his own rally, and a woman stood up and made some false statements about President Obama. She referred to him as a Muslim and went on, and he stopped her. And he said, ma'am, he is not what those things you said he was. He's a good, God-fearing man who I just happen to have a lot of policy disagreements with, right? And that, to me, that was like a major moment in political history where the nominee of the Republican Party at that time, John McCain, was willing to sort of say, wait a minute, there are boundaries here. And there has to be some decorum, which I think we've seen become degraded over the last 8 years.
And we're not sitting here, and I've not heard this from most Democrats or Republicans since everything unfolded. We're not sitting here saying you have to agree. You're not going to agree. That's why there's two different parties in the country. You know, and it could be, you know, we could have a disagreement on, you know, you might like peanut butter jelly, I might not.
Crunchy.
You don't have to take it. It doesn't have to be taken to that level. And I think that's the message that I've heard from people on both sides of the aisle this week. But I think that message needs to be consistent, and I think it needs to continue, which I think is another thing that I've asked. Is it sustainable? It's one thing for, former President Trump, if depending on what he says this week when he speaks. We heard it from President Biden on Sunday night rather. It's one thing to hear it, but is it consistent and can be kept up?
I think it's the response when things like what happened recently on Saturday, when we saw this attempted assassination. When these things happen, it's incumbent upon leaders then to respond appropriately. And that is the time to unify. That is the time to say, we're Americans. What happened was wrong. We don't settle our differences politically. We still don't really know much about this individual, in terms of who he was. Registered Republican, really irrelevant, right? Is obviously somebody with a lot of problems that would go through that, those types of, engage in that kind of conduct. But I think it's incumbent upon the leaders to then understand, okay, we need to be clear about how we do this in our country and how we settle our differences. And it's through elections, peaceful. It's through the peaceful transfer of power. That's how we do it.
Speaking of elections, let's shift gears. A lot to talk about, specifically as it relates to the state of Ohio right now. I think the most significant development came within the last 24 hours, and that being, or a little over that, I should say, that being Ohio Senator J.D. Vance, on the job for 18 months, now being selected as a vice presidential candidate of former President Trump, as they both will likely receive that official nod later this week.
Yeah.
From your perspective, Vance is a little bit younger. He brings a little bit of a different energy maybe than either of the two men running, whether it be Biden or Trump right now. What do you think it says about J.D. Vance, him being selected for that spot?
Well, I think, frankly, probably one of the biggest criteria in this selection process was loyalty, and blind loyalty at that. And I think, quite frankly, J.D. Vance has been traveling the state and the country and the world to some extent as an Ohio senator, but doing it to sort of raise his profile, to position himself for this role. Quite frankly, in a sense, been auditioning more or less to take on this role, and apparently, the Trump and his inner circle have made the decision that he's the person they feel most comfortable with. So I think a lot of this had to do with loyalty. I've been taking in various articles about how strategic this decision is. President Trump has carried Ohio in the past. I don't know that. I mean, J.D. Vance underperformed in Ohio, actually, in the 2022 election among Republicans. Mike DeWine had a huge lead for the governor's race. Of course, Congressman Tim Ryan ran against Vance. It was a little closer of a race. So I don't think it was a strategic pick in terms of Ohio and the Midwest, but more about his loyalty. And again, he was somebody that was a fierce Trump critic. So yes. I think he's going to have to answer questions. I mean, at one time, his words, not mine, but at one time, he said he was a never Trumper. He likened the former president to America's Hitler. These are the kinds of things that Mr. Vance said. So he's obviously going to have to explain that. But perhaps the Republicans are thinking he's younger, he's more energetic, and they're starting to think long term. And I think if I could say one thing, I think the Republicans have done well. I'm a Democrat, as you know, but some of the things that they have done well is think about the future in terms of planning and positioning people to run. So perhaps that was somewhat of what went into this decision.
And it seems as if it's maybe helped bring the party together. Thinking back, 2, 4, 6 years ago, the Republican Party was pretty split. You had your Trump supporters, and then you had your more maybe middle of the line Republicans, if you will. But that doesn't seem to matter as we sit and watch this RNC unfold this week.
One of the things I've been saying to my friends, Democratic friends, both privately and publicly, is that we need to be united as the Democratic Party. There was a lot of questions about whether or not President Biden should stay in the race or not. And while some people may have valid concerns about his electability, I don't think we should be airing it on every major national news station. So I thought it was, at this point in the campaign several years ago, they were more fractured Republican Party. At this point, the Democrats seem to be sort of having a circling firing squad, so to speak. To speak to this choice of Senator Vance, I don't know that it gives them a strategic advantage. And I do say that politics is about addition, and how do you grow your margins? How do you grow your support base? Well, frankly, Vance is very much in the image and likeness of Donald Trump. And so I don't know that they necessarily get outside of the people that already support them. So that was one thing that came up after this decision was made is, do you tap into other pockets of the electorate?
That Senate seat now, theoretically, depending on what happens, could be open if the Trump-Vance ticket were to win in November. So that would be one Senate seat that would become open. Meanwhile, we have a race that's on the ballot.
Correct.
In November, that, of course, between the incumbent Sherrod Brown, the Democrat, and the Republican Bernie Moreno, who won the primary this past spring. With that kind of in perspective now, you kind of have two different things that are going to have to be handled, two different spots that are going to have to be handled.
Right.
Let's address that Vance seat. How does that work? What would work theoretically if he's elected?
Sure. Well, theoretically, if he were to become vice president, that would create a vacancy in the U.S. Senate in Ohio. Governor DeWine would have the opportunity to appoint somebody to that seat for a 2-year period to 2026, and then a special election would be held in 2026. So a lot of names being batted around. Governor DeWine did get involved in the primary this year with Bernie Moreno. It was Bernie Moreno, Frank LaRose, and State Senator Matt Dolan.
Mm-hmm.
State Senator Matt Dolan received the support of Governor DeWine. So some are speculating that perhaps he may have the opportunity to take that seat if hypothetically J.D. Vance were to become
Matt Dolan or Governor DeWine?
Matt Dolan.
Okay.
Some people are speculating that Matt Dolan may get that appointment if J.D. Vance is to move on to the vice presidency. Others are saying that President Trump doesn't like Matt Dolan that much and criticized him publicly, and that it would matter what J.D. Vance and Donald Trump want in this instance. The other factor is Sherrod Brown wins, which is very likely that Sherrod Brown wins, and perhaps Bernie Moreno, his opponent, could have the opportunity to be appointed to that seat. I think it's unlikely that Secretary of State Frank LaRose would get that appointment. I think that's probably unlikely. He didn't fare as well in this last election. So that's going to be an interesting dynamic that you see unfold. And, the question kind of comes back to, is Governor DeWine in a position where he's term limited from being governor? He's at the end of his career. He was a U.S. Senator. So I think he places a high value on that position and has sort of his mindset about what a U.S. Senator should do and how they should conduct themselves. So does he take his own, guidance on this, or does he become influenced by President Trump and J.D. Vance? So it's an interesting question. I'm saying to you that Democrats are going to win the presidency, so that's never going to be an issue. But that being said, if it were to happen, certainly the musical chairs would start here in the state of Ohio, and I'm sure some of those conversations are already underway.
Let's talk about that second race, Bernie Moreno and Sherrod Brown. Moreno has closely associated himself with the former president, Trump, of course, closely related, put himself next to J.D. Vance as well. Do you think that will carry any weight now with how things are unfolding?
Well, I think that race was always going to be close, no matter what. I've been on the ballot with Sherrod Brown in 2012. He was successful. He ran 6 years later in 2018. President Trump carried the state in 2016, and Sherrod Brown won in 2018. He's probably the only Democrat remaining that has consistently outperformed whoever is at the top of the ticket. And mind you, in 2016, and I was on the ballot, Hillary Clinton, she didn't do very well. She didn't fare very well, but Senator Brown was able to outperform her. So I think regardless of what happens in the presidential race, we know that Sherrod Brown has consistently been able to outperform the top of the ticket. People and the voters in the state know Senator Brown. He's been helping with issues like the pensions for Teamsters and miners, veterans with who've been exposed to toxic burn pits. He's passed legislation for them. He's got a record of accomplishments, something that he can talk about. And I think generally the working class people in this state, and particularly through this part of Ohio, eastern and southeastern Ohio, they know and trust him and like him. And so that puts him in a great spot. Obviously, Bernie Moreno will have unlimited resources, and he will likely jump on the coattails of the former president. So that race will be a very close race. But I think one that all the polling has been pretty consistent, showing Senator Brown edging out Bernie Moreno.
Let's talk a little bit about the Democrats now. And let's just start with the mood amongst the party, kind of how they're feeling and what things are looking like, and what's been a very split, divisive summer for the party.
Well, we always
say,
well, sure. Particularly after the last debate, right?
Yeah.
Look, I mean, Democrats want to fall in love and Republicans fall in line. And I think we probably need to really start to think about, as a party, what will put us in the best possible position to be successful in the fall. And I am encouraged by the last couple appearances that President Biden has made. I think he is starting to demonstrate to the country that he does have his faculties, that that NATO press conference lasted an hour. He talked about everything from the economy to the inclusion of new states in NATO, to foreign policy, to domestic policy. So I think the only thing you can do as an elected politician and a leader and someone that's been in office, when you're in that situation, the only thing you can do, because you got George Clooney, these actors coming out and all these sort of talking heads on television, no disrespect, but you have all these people sort of giving him advice publicly. And the only thing you can do at that point is go directly to the people that put you in office. 14 million Democrats voted to put President Biden, make him the Democratic nominee. He's got to go and continue to go directly to the voters. And I think that's what he's been doing. And you start to see now, like we saw in Michigan, like we saw recently at the NAACP rally, you start to see the elements of his base rally behind him. Organized labor, the Black community, the Latino community, Hispanic community. So you start to see these elements of his base rally behind him. And similar to what we saw with President Trump after this assassination, America loves somebody who gets knocked down and gets back up, right? And so I think right after that debate, Joe Biden got knocked down and he got right back up. And there was a period there where he was actually pulling ahead of President Trump. So I think Democrats need to, if they have concerns, they need to be made privately, but we need to find a way to help rally around him and make sure that his future appearances before the voters are consistent.
You mentioned they need to keep those concerns internal, but you obviously hear those conversations, you hear those things. Is there genuine concern, whether it be you or people you're with, about the president's health?
I think you get a lot of varying opinions from people who obviously saw the debate and are concerned, from people who are close to him and say, we don't see this on a regular basis. What I have said is it's fine to express those types of concerns you may have. What I also will say is I don't know that making a change at this point necessarily guarantees that we'll win. And if that's something that's going to be discussed, I don't think we need to do it out in the open. However, I think the best thing President Biden can do, and the thing he is starting to do now going forward, is to go directly to the voters, directly to the American people, and start to talk about his record. If you look at his record, and you're not talking about what you see on social media or the cultural issues, you look at his record, he's really delivered. He got an infrastructure bill passed, trillions of dollars in infrastructure being built. You look at what the impact has been here in Ohio, the CHIPS plant coming with the CHIPS bill that he passed, the Intel plant coming to Central Ohio, the Brent Spence Bridge in Cincinnati that was talked about for years. You look at all the money that's made its way back to Appalachia by way of water and sewer and road upgrades. So this has been significant legislation that he's passed. Bipartisan gun reform. I didn't think anybody could pass a gun reform package, right? Especially a bipartisan gun reform bill. And there's a lot being made about the border, and he has passed he offered up a bipartisan border bill. It got killed. So I think he has a record to run on. And certainly the best thing he can do is put that forward and go directly to the American people and demonstrate to them that he's capable of doing this another 4 years.
Do you think the party did itself a disservice? You complimented the Republican Party in having a little bit of a plan for the future, looking ahead. Do you think the Democrats may have did themselves a little bit of a disadvantage by maybe not using the last 4 years of Biden's presidency to do that?
I wouldn't say put us at a disadvantage. I do think there's a lot of young talent. I mean, if you look across the country, Governor Gretchen Whitmer, Governor Shapiro, the governor out of Maryland, is it Westmore? I mean, you have a lot of young
Gavin Newsom in California.
Gavin Newsom, who I've followed for many years. You have a lot of young up and coming politicians. I mean, the governor bench is substantial. So I don't think we've done ourselves a disservice. I mean, Joe Biden stepped forward at a time where I think the country and the voters were looking for some stability, and he stepped forward at that time and he won. And so, sometimes you stick with your horse, but my thought is at this point in the campaign, if he's going to remain as our nominee, we need to continue to see people rally around him. I do think substantial parts of his base, he has been the most pro-labor union president in modern history. And we're starting to see a lot of those voices step forward for him like we did in Detroit.
We have the RNC, obviously, this week. The DNC comes up in Chicago in August. Between now and then, what does the party need to do to maybe bridge some of the gap or unite some of people that they have, on two sides right now?
Really, I think it's continuing to go directly to the American people. I really do. I think, and quite frankly, in some of the key battleground states. I've joked with people. I said, if I was running for president, I'd get an apartment in Detroit and an apartment in Milwaukee, and I would just go back and forth. Right. So it is just a handful of states that you've got to be competitive in. And in a way, as bad as the debate was, and as difficult as a moment as that was for Democrats, in a way, it kind of lit a fire, I think, underneath the president and the campaign, in a way, sort of to get them to say, hey, you've got to focus on, you're doing a great job convening NATO, passing, landmark legislation, but there's another element of this, and that's the campaign, right? And you've got to get out to the people in these key swing battleground states.
Anything right now at the state level or maybe local level that you think folks should be aware of as we sit a few months out from the election?
It's pretty quiet right now at the Capitol in Columbus. It's summertime, usually is. As legislators go on break, they go home for the summer. When I say they go home, they work pretty hard. In fact, there were times when I recall it was easier to have to travel to Columbus once a week because I was in my district 7 days a week. You have county fairs, you have parades, you have festivals, and your constituents want to see you. The biggest issue, I think, the biggest question mark surrounding the state house, I think, going forward, not so much a policy or substantive issue, but will there be a shakeup in the Ohio House was for Speaker. As you know, the current Speaker, Speaker Jason Stevens, has been fending off a threat internal threat from fellow Republicans, right, who want to dismantle his reign and possibly turn it over to the current Senate president. It'd be a historic moment where you have a Senate president come over from the Ohio Senate, leading that chamber to walking right into another chamber. So as we get to the end of the year here, it's going to be really interesting to see how that dispute between these two leaders unfolds and whether or not we have a change in leadership come early next year. So there's a lot of things that'll be watched here in the fall to see if there's any signals that occur that will give you an indication of which way that's going to go. Speaker Stevens lost control of the House Republican campaign arm, which was a significant, at least optically, a significant development this summer. But again, you never know what's going to happen. And I say, like in the election, 12 weeks or 18 weeks, I don't know how many weeks there are, but that's an eternity in politics, as we saw over the last 5 days.
Yeah.
How much can shift in an election. And as somebody who has run, who has won, who has lost, I can tell you, I don't get too consumed by polls. You're ahead in the polls until you're not, or you're ahead into the polls until you get there on election day.
Right.
And I recall seeing polls, as early as August, September, where I was leading, and that could all be erased. And so there are a lot of things that can still happen yet in this election.
Sure. This is a very general question, but I do want to ask it. Do you see any progress in maybe, you know, we talk about it all the time, forgotten Ohio and the eastern part of Ohio. We see, you know, Columbus gets Intel, Cincinnati gets, I think it was General Motors, plant Marysville,
Yeah.
Honda.
Honda
I'm
plant,
sorry, it was
yeah,
Honda. Yeah. Do we see any more of a focus or an effort to maybe outsource some of that to smaller communities, maybe the Mahoning Valley or the Ohio Valley?
I mean, it's a great question. I'm not sitting in office these days, so
Sure.
I don't have the ability to affect that. You know, I know that I can tell you that regardless of which political party is in power, our part of the state traditionally has really had to fight very hard to get its fair share, regardless of who's in power. And now Governor DeWine, to his credit, has put forth a couple of initiatives focused on Appalachia, Ohio. And quite frankly, Governor Kasich made a lot of promises and commitments that never developed. And so, you know, it really depends upon you know, the pressure that's being placed on these folks that are in Columbus. But also, you know, the state doesn't always drive all the economic development decisions, right? I
Right.
mean, you know, you have companies looking to do things, and I think there have been some good things that have happened here. I've worked closely with Long Ridge Energy down in Monroe County. You know, that's a great opportunity for the region. We have a lot of natural resources in this area that are still vital for our security, our national security. So, you know, I like to be optimistic about the state. You talk to, you know, the construction industry. Now it's maybe slower in some pockets, but even though some of these projects find themselves in other parts of the state,
Right.
some of that construction work does bleed over into the Mahoning or the Ohio Valley. So, you know, it's important that, you know, the economy is placed at the forefront, and that's the number one issue for, I think, our political leaders.
Lou, any other topics or things that you'd like to touch on?
No, like I said, I think it's you know, it's still early yet. We've seen just in the last week how election can be transformed.
Right.
Obviously, the Republicans, I think, coming out of their convention and you know, on the heels of that horrific attack, likely to get a bump in the polls. But there's still plenty of time, I think, for Democrats to rally, to unite. I think President Biden's getting his sea legs again. He's shown a lot of passion and enthusiasm. And I'm glad to see a lot of the base that surrounds him, his labor, his, you know, core base of the Democratic Party really coming to step in for him. And I think that, you know, that makes a difference on election day when you need people on the ground. But we have a lot of time until November 2nd.
Lou, thank you so much.
Great to be with you.
Appreciate you joining us. Hopefully we'll do it again soon.
A lot of fun. Thanks.